The radar scope flickered like a dying heartbeat. It was 0517 hours, May 11, 1945, somewhere in the waters off Okinawa. Seaman Second Class Joseph DeLuca sat alone in the cramped Combat Information Center of USS UW, Hadley, a Fletcher-class destroyer on radar picket duty. The air inside smelled of oil, sweat, and electrical burn. Outside, the Pacific stretched black and endless under a sky just beginning to bruise with dawn. The equipment hummed wrong. It had been humming wrong for 3 days. The sweep line on the cathode ray tube stuttered. The gain knob sparked when touched. Static hissed through his headset in irregular bursts, like something breathing. The chief had promised a repair team. The repair team never came. Now DeLuca sat in the dark, 17 years old, watching a screen that half the crew believed was useless. He adjusted the range ring. The green glow painted his face. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, beyond the range of sight or sound, something was coming. He didn't know it yet, but the broken machine did. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a war of mathematics and madness. Japan was losing. Everyone knew it. The Empire's carrier fleet lay shattered across the floor of the Philippine Sea. Her armies were cut off on distant islands, starving, unreachable. American forces had taken Iwo Jima in March and landed on Okinawa in April. The home islands were within striking distance. Defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. And yet Japan did not surrender. Instead, she turned to a weapon born not of strategy, but of desperation, the kamikaze. The word meant, divine wind, referencing the typhoons that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century. But there was nothing divine about what happened in the skies over the Pacific in 1945. Pilots, many of them barely trained, some with fewer than 50 hours in the cockpit, were loaded into obsolete aircraft, given just enough fuel for a one-way trip, and sent to die. Their mission was simple: find an American ship and crash into it. No return, no escape, just impact. The first organized kamikaze attacks began in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the First Air Fleet, had recognized that Japan no longer had the pilots, planes, or time to fight conventionally. A guided bomb, a human-piloted missile, could bypass the need for precision training. It could turn every plane into a weapon of guaranteed delivery, and it could exploit the one resource Japan still had in abundance, the willingness of young men to die for the emperor. At first, the Americans underestimated the threat. Suicide attacks were beyond the logic of Western military doctrine. But the numbers told a darker story. By the end of the war, kamikaze strikes would account for nearly half of all U.S. naval casualties in the Pacific. They sank dozens of ships, damaged hundreds more, and killed over 4,900 sailors. The attacks were unpredictable, terrifying, and, worst of all, effective. Okinawa became the apex of kamikaze operations. Operation Tengo, or floating chrysanthemums, unleashed wave after wave of suicide planes against the American fleet anchored off the island. Between April and June 1945, over 1,500 kamikaze sorties were launched. The skies filled with Zeros, Vals, Judas, Bettys, anything that could carry a bomb and reach the sea. Some flew alone. Others came in massive formations, coordinated to overwhelm defenses. They struck at dawn, at dusk, during lunch, during midnight watch. There was no pattern, no predictability, just sudden death dropping from empty sky. To counter this, the U.S. Navy established radar picket stations, isolated destroyers and smaller vessels positioned far from the main fleet, serving as early warning tripwires. Their job was to detect incoming raids and vector combat air patrol fighters to intercept before the kamikazes reached the carriers and troop transports. It was lonely, lethal work. Picket ships absorbed attacks meant for others. In 2 months, 15 picket destroyers were sunk or so heavily damaged they never returned to service. The life expectancy of a radar picket station, some sailors darkly joked, could be measured in days. Radar was supposed to save them. It was the technological edge, the invisible shield that reached beyond the horizon. American SC and SG radar systems could theoretically detect aircraft at ranges up to 50 miles, giving crews precious minutes to prepare, to scramble fighters, to bring guns to bear. But theory and reality diverged sharply in the chaos of war. Radar in 1945 was still experimental, temperamental, misunderstood. The systems were mechanical and vacuum tube-based, prone to failure from humidity, voltage spikes, vibration, and salt corrosion. Operators were often teenagers pulled from farms and factories, given a few weeks of training and told to interpret green blobs on glowing screens. They had to distinguish between clouds, rain, islands, friendly planes, and enemy formations, all while dealing with equipment that might cut out, overheat, or produce phantom returns that looked exactly like real targets. And the Japanese knew this. Kamikaze pilots flew low, skimming wave tops to stay under radar coverage. They approached from the direction of the sun. They mixed with returning American aircraft. They flew in tight groups to appear as a single contact. They exploited weather, terrain, and the limitations of the machines designed to stop them. The teenagers watching those screens carried an impossible burden. A missed contact meant death, not just theirs, but that of hundreds of men aboard ships miles away. A false alarm meant wasted fighter sorties, exhausted pilots, eroded trust. Every blip had to be evaluated in seconds. Every decision was final. There were no second chances at sea. Joseph DeLuca had joined the Navy in January 1944, 3 months after his 17th birthday. He lied about his age. His mother signed the papers anyway. He grew up in South Philadelphia, the son of a dockworker, and had never seen the ocean until boot camp. They sent him to radar school in Norfolk, where instructors taught him to read scopes, adjust frequencies, estimate ranges. He was good at it. Quiet, patient, methodical. The kind of kid who could sit still for hours and notice things others missed. By April 1945, he was assigned to Hugh W. Hadley, a destroyer commissioned just months earlier. The ship had seen action at Iwo Jima and was now part of Radar Picket Station 15, positioned 70 miles northwest of Okinawa. It was one of the most dangerous posts in the fleet. The crew knew it. DeLuca knew it. But orders were orders, and fear was something you swallowed and kept moving. His watch began at 0400. 4 hours alone in the CIC, monitoring the air search radar while the rest of the ship slept or stood their own posts. The room was no bigger than a closet. A single chair, a desk bolted to the deck, the radar console humming in the dark. A sound-powered phone connected him to the bridge. A repeater showed the ship's heading and speed. Everything else was just him and the scope. 3 days earlier, the radar had started acting up. The sweep line, which should have rotated smoothly, began stuttering, jumping erratically across the screen. The gain was unstable. Sometimes targets appeared too bright, sometimes they vanished entirely. The range markers drifted. Static bled into the returns, creating a grainy fog that made interpretation nearly impossible. The electronics officer inspected it twice, tightened connections, replaced a tube. Nothing helped. He declared the unit marginal and logged a request for parts. Parts that were somewhere on a supply ship, or back in Pearl Harbor, or maybe never coming at all. Other radiomen hated using it. They complained that it gave false contacts, that you couldn't trust anything it showed. The officer of the deck had even considered securing the system entirely and relying on visual spotters and the backup surface search radar. But DeLuca didn't mind. He had learned the machine's quirks, its moods. He knew which frequencies made the static worse. He knew that if you turned the gain down slightly and increased the brilliance, the real contact stood out better. He knew the difference between a ghost return and something solid. The equipment was broken, yes, but it still worked. You just had to listen differently. On the morning of May 11th, the sea was calm. Visibility was good. The ship was making lazy circles at 12 knots, maintaining station. The Combat Air Patrol, for Corsairs from the carrier Enterprise, checked in at 0445, reporting negative contacts. Everything felt routine, quiet, almost peaceful. DeLuca adjusted the brightness. The static hissed. The sweep line stuttered. And then, at the very edge of the scope, 43 miles out, something appeared. It wasn't much. Just a faint smudge, barely brighter than the noise. On a functioning radar, it might have registered as a clear blip. On this one, it looked like a mistake. DeLuca watched it for 2 sweeps. 3. It didn't fade. It moved. Slowly, steadily, closing the range. Bearing 315 degrees, northwest. Altitude uncertain. Speed maybe 150 knots. He reached for the sound-powered phone. His hand hesitated. If he reported a ghost, they'd pull him off the scope. If he stayed silent and it was real, people would die. He watched the screen. The contact grew slightly sharper. Still faint, but persistent. His gut told him it was real. Bridge, CIC. Possible air contact, bearing 315, range 43 miles, closing. The reply came back flat, skeptical. CIC, bridge. Confirm that contact. We have nothing visual. Confirmed. Single bogey, intermittent return. Could be low altitude. There was a pause. Then, Roger. Keep tracking. Notify if it firms up. DeLuca exhaled. The contact continued inbound. At 40 miles, a second blip appeared, slightly offset from the first. Then a third. Then two more, scattered across a 5-degree arc. All faint. All moving together. All heading directly toward the ship. He keyed the phone again. Bridge, CIC. Multiple contacts now. Count 5, possibly more. Bearing 310 to 320, range 38 miles. This time, the voice on the other end sharpened. CIC, say again contact count. 5 confirmed, sir. Maybe 6. They're grouped tight, low altitude. Range now 37 miles, speed approximately 150 knots. Stand by. He heard the general quarters alarm sound topside. Feet hammered across the deck. Voices shouted. The ship's engines revved as the helm came hard over, turning bow on to the threat. Gun crews scrambled to their mounts. The Corsairs overhead were vectored northwest. DeLuca kept his eyes on the scope. The contacts multiplied. 7, 8, 9. 9 aircraft, closing fast, and the sky was still empty. The thing about radar that most people didn't understand, and that DeLuca was only beginning to grasp, was that it didn't show you reality. It showed you echoes, reflections, radio waves bouncing off metal and skin and returning to the antenna. What you saw on the screen was not the world, but a translation of it, filtered through electricity and interpreted by a human brain trained to guess. A perfectly functioning radar was optimized for ideal conditions. It amplified strong returns and filtered out weak ones. It prioritized clarity, range, and ease of interpretation. But war wasn't ideal. Kamikaze pilots flew wooden aircraft covered in fabric. They skimmed the waves, where radar beams bent and scattered. They came in small groups, hugging the noise floor of the system. A normal radar, tuned for bombers at altitude, often missed them entirely. DeLuca's radar was broken. The gain circuit was unstable, amplifying everything, including the noise. The filter that should have smoothed out weak returns was malfunctioning, letting through signals that would normally be discarded as clutter. The result was a screen full of static, chaotic and unreadable to most operators. But within that chaos, faint contacts that a working radar would have ignored now appeared. Not clearly, not reliably, but they appeared. It was like trying to hear a whisper in a storm. Except DeLuca had learned to hear storms. He had spent 3 days listening to this broken machine. He knew the texture of its noise. He knew what sea clutter looked like, what rain looked like, what a ghost return from a wave looked like. And this was different. This was metal. This was intent. At 32 miles, the Corsairs made contact. The lead pilot's voice crackled over the radio. Tally ho, tally ho. Multiple bogies, low and fast, heading 130. Engaging. Gunfire chattered through the air. The Corsairs dove. One kamikaze went down trailing smoke. Another exploded mid-air. But there were too many. 7 remained, now splitting into 2 groups. One group turned south toward the main fleet. The other, for aircraft, continued straight toward Hadley. At 20 miles, DeLuca could see them visually on the surface search radar. At 15, the 5-inch guns opened fire, hurling shells into the sky. Black puffs of flak blossomed against the dawn. One kamikaze disintegrated. Another veered off, smoking, and cartwheeled into the sea. 2 kept coming. At 8 miles, the 40mm Bofors joined in. Tracers laced the air. The kamikazes jinked, weaved, dropped even lower. One was a Zero, the other a Val dive bomber. Both were burning. Both were still flying. DeLuca stayed at his post, watching the scope even though the battle had moved beyond radar's usefulness. He could feel the ship shuddering with each gun salvo. Smoke poured through the ventilation. Someone screamed an order. Someone else screamed in pain. The lights flickered. The radar screen wavered but held. The Zero came in from the port quarter, so low its propeller kicked up spray. Every gun on the port side opened up. The plane staggered, trailing fire, and slammed into the sea 50 yards off the beam. The explosion rocked the ship sideways. Water and shrapnel hammered the hull. The Val approached from starboard, higher, steeper. It was already half destroyed, one wing shredded, cockpit canopy gone. But it held course. The pilot was either dead or dying, but his hand was still on the stick. The 5-inch mount tracked it, fired, and blew the engine apart. The plane tumbled, cartwheeling, and hit the water 30 feet from the hull. The bomb detonated underwater. The shockwave lifted the stern, buckled plating, shattered steam lines. Men were thrown from their feet. Fires erupted in 2 compartments. And then, silence. The kind of silence that comes after violence, thick and ringing. Smoke drifted. Water hissed against hot metal. The ship listed 3 degrees to port but stayed afloat. Damage control teams scrambled. Wounded were dragged below. The Corsairs circled overhead, low on fuel, checking for more targets. There were none. The raid was over. 9 kamikazes had launched. 4 had been shot down by fighters. 3 had been destroyed by the ship's guns. 2 had hit the sea close enough to cause damage. None had struck Hadley directly, because a 17-year-old boy with a broken radar had seen them coming 43 miles away. The Combat Information Center smelled like burnt plastic. The radar scope still glowed, still stuttered. DeLuca sat in his chair, hands shaking, headset still on. He had not moved. He had not looked away from the screen. Even now, even after the guns had fallen silent, he was still scanning, still watching for the next threat. The door opened. The executive officer stepped inside, soot-streaked, eyes red. He looked at DeLuca, looked at the radar, said nothing for a long moment. "Good work, son." DeLuca nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat was closed. The XO left. DeLuca turned back to the scope. The sweep line stuttered. The static hissed. He adjusted the gain and kept watching. The damage assessment took hours. 2 men were dead, killed by shrapnel when the Val's bomb detonated. 11 were wounded. The stern plating was buckled, 1 propeller shaft was bent, and the aft fire room was flooded. But the ship was still operational. She could still steam. She could still fight. Word spread fast through the fleet. Hadley had detected a massed kamikaze raid at extreme range using degraded equipment and had successfully engaged multiple targets with near-total success. The story reached the task force commander by noon. By evening, it was being discussed in fleet headquarters at Guam. By the next morning, an electronics intelligence team was dispatched to inspect the radar personally. They arrived 2 days later, a trio of Navy technicians and a civilian engineer from RCA. They spent 6 hours dismantling the console, testing circuits, tracing signals. Their report, filed on May 15, was 8 pages long. The conclusion was simple: the malfunction in the gain circuit had effectively disabled the automatic noise suppression filter, allowing the radar to detect extremely weak returns that would normally have been discarded as clutter. In optimal conditions, this made the system nearly unusable. But against low-altitude, low cross-section targets like kamikaze aircraft, it provided a detection advantage of nearly 15 miles over standard-tuned equipment. In other words, the broken radar worked better than the working one. The report recommended modifications to fleet radar systems to allow operators to manually disable noise filtering in high-threat environments. It also recommended additional training for radar operators in interpreting weak and ambiguous contacts. But most of all, it recommended that operators like DeLuca, quiet, patient, intuitive, be identified and retained, because technology alone was not enough. You needed someone who could listen to the machine and understand what it was trying to say. DeLuca was not promoted. He was not decorated. He was not interviewed by reporters or mentioned in dispatches. He returned to his watch rotation, for hours on, for hours off, alone in the CIC with the humming, stuttering, broken radar that had saved his life and the lives of everyone aboard. The war would end 3 months later. The kamikaze attacks would stop. The radar would eventually be repaired, and when it was, it became just another piece of equipment, reliable, predictable, ordinary. No one ever spoke about the 2 weeks it spent broken. No one remembered that it had worked better that way. Except DeLuca. He remembered. Years later, long after the war, long after the Navy, he would tell the story to his grandchildren. About the morning the screen filled with static. About the faint smudges that no one else could see. About the moment he chose to trust the machine even though everyone said it was useless. Sometimes, he would say, the things that are broken are the only things that can see the truth. The radar scope in Hugh W. Hadley's Combat Information Center flickered for the last time on August 12, 1945, 3 days before Japan surrendered. The ship was anchored off Okinawa, waiting for orders to return to Pearl Harbor. The war was over. The kamikazes were gone. The skies were quiet. DeLuca sat alone in the CIC, watching the screen even though there was nothing to watch. The sweep line rotated smoothly now. The gain was stable. The static had been cleaned from the signal. It was perfect, flawless, exactly as it was designed to be, and it saw nothing. He reached out and adjusted the brightness one last time. The green glow filled the room. Outside, the sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the water gold and red. Somewhere far away, pilots who had been prepared to die were walking home. Somewhere closer, the ghosts of the men who hadn't made it were slipping beneath the waves. DeLuca turned off the radar. The screen went dark. He stood, stretched, and walked out into the light. The machine had done its job. So had he. And in the end, that was all that mattered.